Hello there, Dreadfuls. Welcome back to the Dr. Dread podcast. I'm Jean, and tonight I'm going to do something a little bit different. Tonight I just have a few creepy stories for you all. I hope you all will enjoy. If you're fans of the other format, don't worry, we will be continuing with that, where we discuss weird history, weird folklore, weird science, true crime, etc., etc. But this is just something else I wanted to start throwing in there, so I hope you all enjoy our creepy stories for tonight. Tale number 1. When I was a kid, I thought my church was just a small, passionate congregation tucked into the Appalachian foothills of Kentucky. But looking back now, I understand it was something far darker, an apocalyptic cult. Their practices were bizarre, but none more unsettling than the ritual of speaking in tongues. They taught us that this was the language of heaven, the only true sign that God had chosen to save you. If you didn't have it, you wouldn't ascend when the rapture came. Instead, you'd remain on earth for the apocalypse and then burn in hell for eternity. Imagine hearing that as a child, over and over, until it burrowed into the core of who you were. To receive the gift, as they called it, you had to go to the front of the church during altar call. These were wild, feverish gatherings after every service. People crowded the pulpit, screaming prayers, sweating, crying, collapsing, desperate for salvation. I spent years at those altar calls, pleading with God to save me, but no matter how hard I begged, the gift never came. At first, I thought I just wasn't trying hard enough. Then I started to wonder if maybe I wasn't good enough. But over time, a much darker thought took hold. Maybe I wasn't meant to be saved. Things escalated when I turned 16. The pastor, a firebrand woman with a voice that could shake the walls, announced that the rapture was imminent. We began having services every night. The sermons became more and more graphic, the warnings more terrifying, and the altar calls even longer. The pressure to speak in tongues, to be saved, was suffocating. One night, after hours at the altar, the pastor pulled me aside. "You're trying too hard," she said, her tone soft but firm. "Next time, just say, 'Hallelujah,' over and over. Let God work through that." Desperate, I took her advice at the next altar call. I knelt at the steps, shouting "Hallelujah" until my throat burned. The church elder, a man named Brother John, came over to help. He was known for his intense, hands-on prayers, especially with the younger boys. That night he knelt behind me, whispering encouragement, his hands heavy on my shoulders. "Hallelujah," I screamed again and again. My voice wavered, the words slurring into nonsense. Around me, the congregation erupted in cheers. The pastor leaned in close, her breath hot and wet against my ear. "Yes," she whispered, her voice twisting the word into something unrecognizable. "Keep going." I kept shouting, my mind fogging, my body trembling. The heat of Brother John's hands spread across my back, and the pastor's voice in my ear became almost inhuman. Her words blurred into a guttural, rhythmic chant, something ancient and wrong. My chest tightened, my head swam, and suddenly, something shifted inside me. The world around me went silent, cold and thick. It felt like I was underwater, detached from my body. And then I felt something watching me, inside me. A presence, dark and vast, curling in the pit of my stomach. My mouth opened and a sound I didn't recognize spilled out, a guttural, choking cry, like a mix of laughter and agony. The next thing I knew, I was being pulled to my feet. The congregation was ecstatic. "You've got it," someone shouted. I wanted to feel joy, relief, but all I felt was emptiness, hollowed out, violated. That night I lay awake in bed, replaying everything in my mind. I wanted to believe I'd finally been saved, but the cold weight in my chest told me otherwise. As I stared at the ceiling, I heard something, a faint whisper. It was coming from my own mouth. But it wasn't my voice. It wasn't even a language. But I understood it. Not now, it said, but soon. I never went back to the church after that. Rejecting my faith destroyed my relationship with my family, but I couldn't stay. I left, rebuilt my life, and buried those memories deep. For years, I convinced myself that it had been a bad dream or a trick of my overactive teenage imagination. Then, last night, it all came back. I was standing at my sink washing dishes when it started. A tightness in my chest, a cold pressure in my throat. I coughed, gagged, and then it spoke. Really soon now, the voice said. My voice, but not me. My hand slipped, shattering a plate. Blood from the cut dripped into the sink, swirling in the water. And then I felt it. Not it, them. I couldn't explain it, but in that moment, I was connected to every person from the church who had ever spoken in tongues. Their thoughts, their fear, their pain, it all flooded into me at once. And I knew they felt me too. Somewhere across the world, they were screaming, and so was I. The voice was louder now, constant, insistent. It didn't just whisper anymore. It laughs. And when it speaks, I understand what it's saying. It's almost time. What's coming? I don't know if it's the rapture, the apocalypse, or something worse. I just know one thing. We didn't speak in tongues that night. It spoke through us. Tale number 2. Let me take you back to the summer of 2009, deep in the Adirondack Mountains of upstate New York. 5 of us, Alex, Derek, Claire, Maddie, and me, decided to celebrate high school graduation with a camping trip. It was supposed to be an unforgettable adventure. Well, it was, just not for the reasons we'd hoped. The sky had lit up with an eerie shade of crimson just as we arrived. The flashes of light were faint, as if someone high above was waving a flare light. We joked about aliens as we pitched our tents in the clearing, the forest around us alive with the sounds of chirping insects and rustling leaves. Derek, the fastest at everything, finished setting up his tent and volunteered to gather firewood. I remember him grinning as he grabbed his flashlight and headed off. Derek and I had worked the graveyard shift together at the gas station, and he was always the brave one, never fazed by the creepy stuff that came with late nights. It felt natural that he'd go alone. Alex was still fumbling with his tent, muttering about instructions as his glasses slid down his nose. Maddie and Claire teamed up on their tent, giggling and teasing each other. The dynamic felt so natural, comfortable, safe. And yet, as the sun dipped behind the trees, that sense of safety started to fray. Derek returned as we were arranging chairs around the fire pit. The branches in his arms rustled as he stepped into the clearing. Geez, thanks for saving me a seat, he joked, dropping the wood. But his words didn't land the way they should have. We all froze, staring at the chairs. 5 chairs were already occupied. The thought was there, gnawing at the edges of my mind, but I couldn't grasp it. My head felt heavy, my thoughts muddled. I scanned the group. Everyone looked uneasy. Alex adjusted his glasses for the 100th time, his gaze darting nervously from one person to the next. Maddie and Claire exchanged worried glances. Let's just light the fire, Derek said, snapping us out of it. I helped him arrange the wood while Claire lit a match. We huddled close to the growing flames, the temperature dropping fast as darkness swallowed the forest. Maddie passed around drinks. We laughed, told stories, tried to push the weirdness aside. For a while, it almost worked. Until I noticed something. Hey, who actually lit the fire? I asked, my voice cutting through Maddie's story. Derek frowned. I thought it was you. No, it wasn't me, I said. Claire's face went pale. It must have been the guy standing behind Maddie, she whispered, her voice shaking. Maddie whipped around. Nothing. Just shadows. But the atmosphere shifted. The forest, once alive with sound, had gone silent. Dead silent. We all felt it, this oppressive, suffocating dread. We should leave, Claire said, her voice cracking. It's too dark, Alex argued. We'd get lost. Then no one sleeps in separate tents, Derek said firmly. We all agreed. No one would sleep alone. We arranged our tents together in a tight U shape, so their openings faced each other. It felt safer that way. But Alex, ever the loner, insisted on staying in his own tent. But we assured him he'd be fine with his tents so close together. I should have fought harder. I should have known better. The scream came just as I was drifting off. Maddie's voice tore through the night, pulling us all to our feet. Derek and I sprinted to Alex's tent, shoving Claire and Maddie aside. Alex was in there, but not how we'd left him. His body was twisted, folded unnaturally inside his sleeping bag, his face frozen in terror. Blood pooled beneath him, soaking the tent. Maddie started to sob uncontrollably, Claire shaking her, trying to snap her out of it. Run, Derek barked, grabbing the flashlight. We're leaving. Now. We tore through the trail, sticking close together. The beam of the flashlight wavered as Derek led the way, its weak light barely cutting through the darkness. The forest seemed alive, shifting and twisting in around us. Maddie tripped, twisting her ankle. Claire stopped to help her, but before we could react, they were gone, pulled into the trees. Claire! I screamed, but Derek grabbed my arm, stopping me from chasing after her. No, we have to keep going, he hissed. His face was pale, his hands shaking. I wanted to argue, but then Claire's voice was silenced. The air felt like it had been sucked out of the forest. I followed Derek, running blindly, my legs burning, threatening to give out. At some point, there were 3 of us on the trail. Derek and I were running side by side, but there was someone behind us. Their footsteps heavy, their breath loud. Derek, I gasped, who's behind us? He turned, his expression shifting from confusion to horror. He shoved the keys into my hand. Run. Don't stop. What are you? Go, he shouted, pulling out a pocket knife and turning to face whatever was following us. I didn't stop. I couldn't. The trail seemed endless, my legs trembling with exhaustion. Then, suddenly, I burst into the parking lot. The car was there, a beacon of safety. I fumbled for the keys, my hands slick with sweat, and threw myself into the driver's seat. I sped out of the parking lot, down the highway. I dared a glance in the rearview mirror. The back seat was empty, or so I thought. Now, I'm sitting at a rest stop, typing this out on my phone. The sun is rising, and help is supposedly on the way. But there's something I need to check first. The silence in the back seat has been gnawing at me. I have to know if I really made it out alone. Wish me luck. Tale number 3. I don't know who will find this. I wish I could say it was all a weird coincidence, a bad feeling or a dream that never came true. Hell, even that I was just going crazy. But the truth is, I know exactly what happened. And now I'm writing this down in the hope that someone will understand before it's too late. It started with Jax. Lana, the school's admissions officer, pulled me aside the day before Jax arrived. She led me into an empty hallway, making sure we were far removed from anyone who might overhear. She spoke in a whisper, the kind that makes your skin crawl. There's a new boy joining your class tomorrow, she said, and there's a few things you need to know. At the time, I thought she was just giving me a heads up. Typical new student stuff. But then she told me about what happened to Jax before he'd come to Cedar Creek. As she spoke, my stomach started to twist. 3 months ago, Jax had been found at the Cedar Creek gas station, alone, barefoot, shoving chips into his mouth like he hadn't eaten in days. The store clerk had to stop him from tearing open bags and stuffing his cheeks. He was thin, feverish, his face nearly colorless. The officers who came to pick him up said he wouldn't talk to them. Not a single word. They were only able to figure out who he was thanks to an old woman who happened to recognize him. She said she'd seen him at the park, always at night, with his mother, just the 2 of them. She lived on the same street, she explained. She was hesitant to give his address, but eventually did. When the police found it, they couldn't believe what was inside. The house was falling apart, the kind of place you'd expect to find abandoned. And there, halfway out of the kitchen, they found Jax's mother, dead. But it wasn't just any death. Lana explained that she'd been ripped open, chest exposed, ribs wide, and this is the part that will haunt me forever. Her heart was missing. No one could explain it, not even the police. Lana pressed on, saying that Jax had been placed in a foster home and was finally settled enough to start attending school again, even if he was a bit on the quiet side. But the whole situation felt wrong, dark. I couldn't shake that feeling. Jax arrived for his first day of school wearing an old hand-me-down uniform. When I introduced him to the class, I watched as every single student locked eyes on him and conspicuously looked away, one by one. It was like they couldn't stand to look at him for too long. But Jax didn't flinch. He just stared right back. As kids do, they started whispering. After recess, I heard one of the girls, Ellie, saying that Jax hadn't played with anyone. He just stood there the whole time, watching and counting. At first, I didn't think much of it. Kids do weird things sometimes, and Jax had been through a lot. Maybe he just wasn't comfortable approaching the other kids yet. But then one of the boys, Mark, told me that Jax had followed him into the bathroom, stood outside the stall, breathing so quietly that Mark thought he'd left, until he opened the door and found Jax inches away from his face. I felt terrible for thinking it, but something about Jax wasn't right. Something more than any trauma he'd endured. It was after art class that I really started to see just how wrong it was. I caught Jax lingering after everyone else had left. He was staring at my demonstration, a simple rabbit crafted from popsicle sticks and cotton balls. But the way he looked at it, there was something cold in his eyes, something calculating. I asked him if he wanted to show me his drawing that he'd done in art class, and he handed it to me without saying a word. When I saw it, my blood went cold. The drawing was of a figure, small, bound and chained up, surrounded by twisted, contorted shapes. Dark circles dotted the page, but they weren't just marks. They looked like holes, like mouths. And in the center, Jax, I knew it, was bound in chains. "Who is this?" I asked, already knowing the answer. "Me," he said, his voice flat, dead. "That's what my mom did." I remember my heart sinking as I tried to process his words. "Why?" I asked, trying to steady myself. "Why would she do that?" "To keep the bad parts in," Jax said, his eyes never leaving mine. I felt a chill run down my spine. I wanted to comfort him, to tell him it wasn't his fault, that he was safe now, but something told me that wasn't true. And I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever it was inside of Jax, it wasn't just grief. It was something darker and older. But I didn't know how deep that went until the first incident. It happened after spelling bee practice. Lauren, a sweet girl, had gotten the word necessary right, and as a reward, I stamped a star on her hand. I didn't notice Jax's eyes on me until later. Then, during recess, Lauren came to me, her face pale, her hand wrapped in a scarf. At first I thought maybe she was just being dramatic, but when she unwrapped it, my stomach dropped. Her hand was bruised, dark and purple, and the stamp gone. She explained, between sobs, that Jax had forced her hand against the brick wall and scrubbed it until the stamp disappeared. When I confronted Jax about the incident, explaining that he couldn't treat people that way, he just stared at me. He didn't flinch, didn't even blink. "Why did you give it to her?" he asked, his voice unnervingly calm, "if you knew it would upset me?" Jax was suspended for 3 days, but I knew this wasn't a normal child. This wasn't just some troubled kid. This was something else. After that, things started to escalate. Kids kept getting hurt. Mark was locked in a supply closet. Lauren's lunch was sabotaged with glass shards. And it wasn't just the physical harm. It was like Jax was always watching. His eyes never left me. Then came the night everything changed. It was late. I was sitting at a bar with John, a local officer who'd been helping me through the whole situation with Jax. I started telling him about the drawings, the incidents at school, the growing dread. I wasn't really scared yet, but I was starting to see a pattern. John listened, and then, after a pause, he told me something I wasn't ready to hear. "Look, there's something you need to know about Jax's mom," he said, glancing around the bar as if someone might overhear. "You remember the cult, right?" My stomach dropped. "The Sisters of Salvation?" John nodded. "That's the one. Jax's mother was one of them, and she didn't escape unscathed. We found journals, logs of what she did to him, chained him to a chair for days, left him to memorize verses, made him kneel on boards with nails. She thought she was keeping him from becoming something bad." I felt sick. "But it gets worse," John said, his voice dropping even lower. "She had this device. We found it in the basement. I don't want to tell you what it was, but it wasn't for keeping someone good. It was for keeping them down, keeping them quiet." Before I could even process his words, I felt a wave of cold. And Jax was standing right behind me. John tried to smile. "Hey, Jax, how's it going?" But Jax didn't smile back. He stared at John with pure, unfiltered hatred. "My mom used to pray, too," he said softly, his voice dripping with malice, "right until the end, even when I pulled things out of her." It was at that moment I knew. Jax wasn't just a victim. He was the thing his mother had tried to control, and she hadn't been strong enough. I left the restaurant that night in a daze, my mind spinning. The next morning, I found Jax's drawing, a new one. But this one was different. It showed me and Jax, close together, in what looked like a basement. We were smiling, my arm around his shoulders. It was sweet, I kept telling myself. Jax felt safe with me, which he desperately needed in his life. But the longer I stared at it, the more wrong it felt, like something was lurking just beneath the surface. And then the next day, John was found in his apartment, dead, with his chest ripped open, his heart missing. The next few months came and went, and John's murder remained unsolved. I knew, deep in my soul, that Jax was responsible. I racked myself with guilt, debating endlessly about telling the police my suspicions, but I always came to the same conclusion. What exactly could I tell them? They'd never believe me that a child committed such a vicious act. Was he even physically capable of it? I couldn't articulate even to myself why I knew Jax was responsible. I just knew that he was. Meanwhile, the incidents with his classmates continued, and he kept watching me. Finally, after endless mental circles, I decided that I needed a change. I couldn't do anything about Jax, and I couldn't spend the rest of my life torturing myself about John's death. So I accepted a job at a new school opening on the other side of the state, and let my school know that I would be leaving at the end of the school year. On the last day of school, several of the students brought me small gifts. Sweet-smelling candles, small bouquets of flowers, hand-drawn cards. Jax lingered after all the students had been dismissed and eagerly rushed out the door to start their summer break. He wordlessly approached my desk and handed me a sheet of paper. "I made this for you," he said. I took the paper and looked at it. It was a recreation of the first drawing that he'd given me, again of me and Jax together, his arm around my shoulders. But this time we were in what looked like a basement or cellar, and this time surrounded by strange shapes I couldn't quite make out. I managed a quiet, "Thank you." "Are you really going away?" Jax asked. "Yes," I replied. "There's a new school that opened, and they need teachers, so I'm going to teach there." Jax stared at me, eerily intense for a boy his age. "I don't want you to go," he said. Before I could reply, he turned and walked out of the classroom. And then, just when I thought I was leaving Jax and the disturbing mystery around him behind, it happened. Moving day. I was driving out of Cedar Creek, heading to start a new life, leaving everything behind. But then I saw him, Jax, standing in the middle of the road. I swerved to avoid him. My car spun out of control. I remember the crash, the metal twisting, the glass shattering. I was dazed, my vision blurry, and through the wreckage I saw Jax, smiling at me. Darkness swam at the edge of my vision as he pressed his hand against the cracked window. "It's okay, Miss Carla," he whispered. "We're going to be a family now." I woke up on a cold cement floor. My head pounded as I sat up, looking around the room. It was large and windowless, lit with a single naked bulb dangling from the center of the ceiling. As my eyes adjusted to the light, morbid images came into focus. Chains and hooks hanging from the ceiling, tables laced with restraints, vicious-looking blades and instruments I couldn't name adorning the walls. I could swear my heart stopped as I realized where I must be. The basement in Jack's old house. It was his first drawing come to life. "You're awake!" Jax cried joyously as he knelt beside me, brushing errant strands of hair out of my face with his tiny fingers. "I was worried I hurt you too much, but I tried to be careful. I'm getting better at being careful." "Why?" I managed to squeak out. "Because you're going to be my new mom," he proclaimed, as if the answer were obvious. "My last mom was bad. She thought the machines could keep the bad parts in, but that just made them stronger. But you understand. You'll be a good mom, won't you, Miss Carla? You'll love me, right? Then I won't have to hurt anyone else." The worst part was that I believed him. Behind the thing responsible for terrorizing the other kids at school, his real mother's fate for John, was a hurt kid desperate for connection, for love. "Of course I'll be your mom," I whispered, watching his face light up with terrible, inhuman joy. "I knew you would," he cried. "I have some things to do. I'll be right back, so wait right here for me, okay? Don't go anywhere, Mommy." Jax almost skipped up the basement steps to a nearly rotted wooden door and left the basement. When I was certain Jax was really gone, I scrambled up the stairs and tried the door. It was locked. I frantically searched the room for something, anything I could use to help me escape. I don't remember actively noticing it, but somehow I ended up climbing back up the stairs with something vaguely resembling a machete in hand. I hacked desperately at the door, slowly splintering away enough wood to form a hole large enough to squeeze through, more a testament to the decrepit state of the door than my strength. I forced myself through the jagged hole, earning plenty of cuts and splinters in the process, and ran faster than I ever had. I recognized enough of the largely unfamiliar neighborhood to make my way to the Cedar Creek bus station. I frantically purchased a ticket for the first bus to depart, silently thanking any god who would listen that I had enough cash in my pocket to cover it. I don't even remember where it was going. I just knew I had to get out. I spent the next several minutes nervously pacing back and forth, looking over my shoulder every few seconds, certain I would see Jax when I turned around. Mercifully, the bus arrived, and I nearly dove onto it when the doors opened. I collapsed into a seat near the back and nearly cried tears of relief when it finally pulled away onto the open road. I haven't stopped moving since. The small amount of cash I had in my pocket ran out long ago. I beg, steal, and even threaten when I need to, but I have to keep moving. Because just when I start to feel safe, just when I think I've put enough distance between us, I hear him, Jax, calling for me. "Mommy, Mommy, where are you? I'll find you, Mommy." And then I feel that same chill I felt the night before John died. I don't know how much longer I have before he finds me, but I know one thing for sure. His voice is getting louder. The cold comes more often. He's getting closer. I hope you enjoyed this episode's terrifying tales. Thank you for listening to the Dr. Dread podcast. And if you'd like to hear more of this content, make sure you like, follow, and subscribe.